The median price of a three-bedroom rental in Cambridge, Massachusetts today is $3,650. I'm Chris Schmidt, and this is Renters Matter. Neighborhood groups are completely unrepresentative. Their claims to represent the community are based entirely in delusion, and their value or their position as having some value to the city is almost entirely illegitimate. I feel very strongly about this because what I found is that neighborhood groups throughout, not just Boston, not just Cambridge, but basically the entire country, are almost always non-representative of the people that they claim to represent. On the Cambridgeport neighborhood mailing list, there are 780 people in a neighborhood with 10,000 residents. When I go to a Cambridgeport Neighborhoods Association meeting, as I did just moments ago, what I find is that the people who are there are not representative of the neighborhood, which is approximately a median age of about 37. And instead what I find is that almost everyone there, to the tune of 75 to 80% of the people, is over the age of 60. In a community that is 45% non-white, there is not a single non-white, or there's one non-white face in the crowd. You're in an area holding this in a meeting room inside of a senior living facility, and overall the entire experience is just entirely non-representative of the Cambridgeport, of the neighborhood that I live in. And this is not a specific critique of the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association. In fact, the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association is probably better on average than many neighborhood associations. And it is certainly not the case that every neighborhood association has this same set of failures. There's different sets of failures for everybody. But the problem is not that these groups exist. The problem is not that people, group together to try and fight for something that they care about. The Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association, for example, has held fundraisers for a local church that needs to get its roof replaced, has done events and held things, and has worked in many cases to improve the neighborhood. I respect all of those things, and I respect the people who've worked on them. What I don't respect is when these people act or are held to be the voice of the community. Because that's really where it falls down. This is most, I think, apparent in the case of the East Cambridge Planning Team. The East Cambridge Planning Team is the East Cambridge's neighborhood association. And what happens is that the East Cambridge Planning Team has for many, many decades at this point been considered the representative group for East Cambridge. But what happens is that the East Cambridge Planning Team does not actually represent the people of East Cambridge. When the Riverside development, the development of the Cambridge Side Galleria originally back in the 1980s was underway, there was a question posed to the neighborhood. Cambridge actually polled the residents of East Cambridge to identify how they felt about the amount of development going on. And I think there were three options, like there's too much development, it's fine, or there's too little, or something along those lines. Like, is it too much or is it not too much? And the people of East Cambridge, 75% of them said everything's fine, like it's just not that big of a deal, like yeah, it's a little bit annoying, but whatever. The East Cambridge Planning Team, on the other hand, who routinely purports to represent the neighborhood, their position was 75% of people said that it was not fine, that it was too much development. I'm thinking about this today because today I went to the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association and they were reviewing a set of documents that are produced by students from a local architectural college. The Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association had come to them and said, hey, we want you to design a number of projects that would be possible at some of these sites for redevelopment that are possible in Cambridge. So the Trader Joe's and Micro Center site at the south end of Cambridgeport, the library site, as well as I think one other that I didn't get a chance to hear. And one of the concerns was at the library site was that, really, they did a demonstration. They said, like, here's how much you could build on the site of the library if you built it, right? And I think that particular site has a 4.0 FAR, which means you could build a 4-story building up to the whole lot, or maybe an 8-story building up to half the lot, and expand that site. And you could create more community rooms. You could put parking underground and have more space. You could do a whole number of things that allow you to build a bigger building there with more space. And and one of the members who was at this meeting, said, well, I really think the trouble that you're going to run into here is that, this really shows how overzoned this site is. That this is clearly out of character with the community or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, I mean, hey, if that's your opinion, like, that's totally cool. Like, this is your opinion. You feel that this site is overzoned. I feel that site is underzoned. I feel, in fact, that the fact that this library site is limited to only have about 12, to be 120 feet tall, to only have, whether that's 12 stories or 10 stories or whatever, when immediately next to it, you have senior living that is 20 stories tall, to say, like, oh, this can only be a 4-story tall building is like, but why? Like, why would that only be a 20-story tall building? Why is this massing so much less than what's next to it? And in fact, why are we looking at this as something that shouldn't be significantly taller, that we shouldn't be talking about 12-story buildings there? Because it's right outside, right on top of, the Red Line. It's right outside of Central Square. It is a perfect site, in fact, to bring more people and homes in, to connect them directly to transit, to create more opportunity for community spaces here, to expand on the existing library on site. Like, why wouldn't that be a good thing? And when you say what you're going to run into is, objections on this being too dense, you're the one who's going to be objecting, dude. Like, you are one of the people, and the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association is one of the groups that will be objecting, that their members will show up and say, like, no, this is too dense. Who else is going to do it? Are you going to have people come in from East Cambridge and say, like, no, I don't think that you should add more community rooms to your library? Like, no, I don't think you should add more affordable units to be developed on your property? Like, that doesn't... Why? Why would someone else do that? Like, you're the community here who's reaching out and saying, like, I think this demonstrates that this is overzoned. Like, your opinion is actually the one that you're representing here. So don't act like you're representing, I think, the opinions of, some invisible cadre or cohort of Cambridgeport residents, of the 10,000 Cambridgeport residents who are going to kind of stand up and say, the library shouldn't be taller. I know it's right next to a building, but that's just not okay. And just to be clear, construction impacts, like, there's lots of reasons why you might not want to make that a 12-story building. I hear that, right? That whole area, the Manning Apartments redevelopment, was just under a bunch of construction. Like I'm not talking about specifics of some development project, which is a different conversation, but rather just the idea that on Green Street that you wouldn't want to have a taller building is kind of silly. I remember when at one point, I was talking to a friend who lived in one of the few 4-story triple deckers in Cambridge, and this at this point would have been like 2008, 2009. And I remember him saying, like, this building is special because, it's you can't build anything like this anymore. It's unusual because they have this, you've got this 4-level triple decker, which basically you can't create in Cambridge. And he's not wrong. On the other side of not Green Street, but whatever's one south of that, like, you can't create a 4-story building for the most part. It's not something that would be allowed by current zoning. But when you're right in the square, you really think that we shouldn't be able to expand and build taller buildings there? You really don't think that we need to be expanding and building up our, like, Central Square? You think that should just be 2- and 3-story tall buildings? That's not representative of how I feel. So I had gone to this meeting because I had previously kind of interacted with these architecture students and talked to them about the affordable housing overlay and some of the objections there had been to that, and talking about that. And so I was interested to see what they had to say. And so I kind of walked in, and I was late because of a bunch of other stuff I had to deal with, but I walked in and I was in the back, and someone walks in later than me who doesn't really understand what the meeting's about, doesn't understand the topic, and I'm trying to explain to him, like, this is like the neighborhood group getting together to try and propose, like, here's what we think we would like. Because one of the problems that happens, and this is a real problem, is that communities don't have a lot of control over the amenities that they would like to see brought in by a developer. We've talked before about the community benefits engagements that Cambridge does being a really expensive way to get what should be public amenities, and really makes the whole process extremely contentious. So the goal here is to kind of develop a set of plans that you can bring to a developer and say like, hey, we really want to talk about what we'd like to see. We'd like to talk about what we'd like to have happen here, and move forward with this idea because we want to, have define our own destiny, right? Like we want to come in and say, here's what we want. We don't want you to suggest a boathouse when what we really want is more community rooms, or we don't want you to suggest something, that's shorter along the riverfront when what we want is for it to be shorter back near the residential or whatever else like that. That developers are oftentimes playing this game where they're trying to guess what the community wants in order to get approval from the community. So if instead the community came to a developer and said like, hey, we know you own this 5-acre parcel of the Trader Joe's and the Micro Center and the Starbucks and the Shell gas station and whatever else like that you own all of these properties, and realistically, we recognize that having this be surface parking lots and a grocery store, the grocery store is very important to us, but we don't want to lose it, but we realize this is not the most effective use of the land. Let's talk about what this could look like. Should this look like, luxury apartments down along the river with the grocery store and a community space or some office space or whatever, and bring that forward and say, here is the plan that has the blessing of the community that we're going to bring to you. And I don't know how far that would go. I don't know these arrangements. I missed the beginning of it, so I didn't hear exactly what the proposal is or how much relationship there is. I do know that neighborhood associations are oftentimes negotiating behind the scenes with developers, in theory on behalf of their membership, but of course their membership is completely non-representative, and even if it were representative, it's not, the case that everyone gets to be involved in this, is that, the elected board or whatever will have these conversations that the membership doesn't participate in. And so I look at this and I'm like, I want more housing. And so this guy comes in, we're talking, and I'm explaining, like, we're trying to come up with plans that the developer that would be amenable to the community, right? Like, this is what is there. And then we're kind of trying to talk quietly because there's stuff going on at the same time. And he says, well, why are they building more housing? And I said, well, I think that there's a understanding that there's more housing, needed in Cambridge. Cambridge is expensive, but there's a need for more housing. I don't think there should be more housing. And I said, so, okay, like, but like we kind of need more housing because otherwise housing, like, it's not possible for kind of younger people to move here. And I think that that's really important to a lot of people. And he said, well, we're already building all that housing up in Central, up on Mass Ave, which again, I'm across the street from that building. The Mass and Main building is, I think, 200 to 300, somewhere in there, units of housing, 200 to 300 homes for people. And that's great. Like, 300 homes is great. But what we need is more like 3,000 a year, the next decade. So I look at the 300 homes that we're building here, and they're great. It's great to have 300 homes. Like, do not get me wrong, but we need a lot more than that to move the city towards the affordability that defined Cambridge for decades, right? That it used to be possible to buy property and build a triple-decker and afford to live here, that thousands of immigrants came to Cambridge and were able to do that because of that. And so I was like, well, you don't think more people should? He's like, well, we already got those apartments up there in Central. And I said, well, I really think that, I feel like in order for me to be able to stay here, like, there has to be more homes. Like, do you think that people like me should be able to move here? And he said, no, if we do that, then, we'll have to build more schools. And I'm like, just sitting here going like, okay. So, like, you're just saying to me, you're not welcome here. Like, you're, as a young person in Cambridge who might have school-age children, which, by the way, I don't anymore, but that's kind of besides the point because, again, we were having a brief side conversation. Like, you're saying to me, I don't want to deal with you. I don't want to deal with the responsibility that comes with having more people live here. We shouldn't be able to have that. Okay. Then I'm not welcome here. Like, then in your position, in your perspective, I'm not welcome here. I'm not welcome in this room. I'm not welcome in this community. And I don't think that represents the community as a whole. I really don't. I really don't think that if you ask the average Cambridgeport resident Like, should there be more people in Cambridge, they would say no. And I definitely think that for the most part, if you said, should we make it possible for more young people to be able to afford to live here, they would say yes. I think that's the representative of what we see in the neighborhood that I'm in. And I think that you can see that from who people voted for in the last two elections. There's a lot more support in the Cambridgeport neighborhood for candidates who are in favor of building more housing, who are in favor of growing Cambridge's population, who are in favor of moving Cambridge forward, who are progressive in the way that I mean it, which is about moving forward and finding ways to kind of continue to grow and improve and progress. But this person who came in and was talking to me seemed to be telling me very clearly, based on what I could tell, I don't want to deal with people like you. And that's why I look at these neighborhood associations and I say, like, this is not a legitimate representation of the neighborhood that I live in. And when I look around the room, what I see is people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and a half dozen who are under 50. It's not a very representative group of the people I see on the street in my neighborhood. It's not a very representative group of the people who I know live in my neighborhood. And this is oftentimes considered the voice of the community. And we talk sometimes, or I've talked sometimes, you and I, Mr. Camera, and all those viewers out there in public access, 8:30 p.m. on a Wednesday TV land, you and I have had the conversation before about the fact that, public comment isn't necessarily representative. That public comment doesn't give you the full view, that it's a metric, but it's not the metric, because being able to sit in a meeting for 3 hours in order to say your 3-minute piece, being willing to come up to the microphone and speak, being willing and able to say those things is a real challenge for people. There's a bunch of structural inequality that makes this less representative. But the neighborhood groups don't actually make that better. Because in order to get a word in edgewise in the neighborhood groups, you have to be able to not only, in many cases, speak in front of them, but also to, communicate in front of a set of people who aren't elected, who are less representative than the council, who are, empowered to argue with you, because you don't have the same rules of decorum that you might in a city council chamber. So it's even harder at that point for you to, achieve representation, because it's a space that kind of rewards those who are better at sharing their own views. So I walked out. I said, you don't think that people like me should live here? I heard the answer, no, and I left. I don't think that he speaks for the neighborhood group, but I don't think that he doesn't speak for the neighborhood group either. I've gotten that message pretty clearly from many members of the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association, is your view isn't welcome here. But while that's the case, it is problematic to have the neighborhood associations be official representation to the city. It is problematic for those people to then have say in things that happen in the city. And this is formalized in some aspects of city planning, right? Like, if you want to get a curb cut, you have to talk to all your neighbors, and then you have to go and get the approval from the neighborhood association. In some cases, by the way, neighborhood associations which don't exist anymore. The city keeps a list of them that they, send emails to, but they don't. Some of them have been, atrophied and died for years. These groups aren't representative, and while they're not representative, I feel like giving them power in formal structures, in city actions, is just wrong. It's just wrong to take something which is, a city decision-making process and involve a non-representative group to act as if they are members of the community. And I think to some extent, this is a little bit of like indictment. Like, I think that the East Cambridge planning team has said no to so many things that I expect that most of the council just recognizes that they're going to say no to most things, and that, you know, colors their bias. But it also means that, like, when they do say yes to something, that's a very different level of power as well. So they have a lever of power that, again, while they're not representative of the neighborhood, they can kind of swing either way. And so this is one of the things I'm worried about with the idea that, you know, you have a developer who comes in and is like, okay, I do want to redevelop the library site or the, you know, the Trader Joe's and Micro Center site or whatever else like that, that if the neighborhood association actually backs something that usually they won't back anything, then that changes a lot of things. That's going to change the development style, the developer's approach potentially, but it's not going to change it in a way that's more representative of what I want, because I feel silenced. And I have some unique characteristics in my neighborhood association, but it is certainly the case that even ignoring some of those unique characteristics, I don't feel like I have a voice to participate. And in fact, when someone in the room said, you know, here's an aspect of truth about these parcels we're talking about, and I said, no, like, I'm looking at the zoning map, they're not zoned like that. I was told I was wrong. And I'm like, you know, I've looked a lot at the zoning map. I know a fair amount about what I'm talking about here. And what you're describing just doesn't exist. The site that you're talking about is not zoned for commercial property. It's zoned for business property. I don't know what to tell you, but that's just the reality. It's a very clear cutout for this property. But he said, no, you're wrong. And I'm like, okay, like, I'm not gonna like get into fisticuffs with you here, but no. Like, both the architectural students and other members of the people sitting at this table and I are all telling you, like, no, this site is zoned for commercial property. Like, they would likely want to develop, you know, office spaces there or whatever. I don't actually think they would, but like that there's, you know, that's a thing. So yeah, neighborhood groups, for the most part, are completely non-representative of the communities they purport to represent. And that lack of representation is not problematic, except where it influences the outcomes as if it were representative. That's the real problem. The real problem is not you have some influence that is commensurate with what you are. You know, if you are a group of, you know, 15 to 20 voting citizens or 100 voting residents of Cambridgeport, and you're going to come out here and you're going to say, hey, we're the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association, we feel this is a valuable thing, and you are evaluated on that based on the idea that you're 100 people who have voted on a board and have some kind of decision-making process, that's great. In the same way that any collective group should be able to do that. In the same way that, you know, I should be able to bring 20 of my friends in and say, like, hi, I am speaking on behalf of 20 of my friends. Here's the petitions we've signed, blah, blah, blah. Like, this is where we're at. That's great. What's not great is when you have that being treated as the voice of the community. Because the community is almost always a lot bigger than that. And this becomes even more problematic when people want to ignore or avoid the results of elections. They're like, well, I don't think our elected officials should be the ones making decisions on this. The neighborhood association should really be making the decisions on this. But the neighborhood associations are run by the same, you know, group of 100 people for the most part, while elections are the result of the will of 20,000 participating voters. And like, the numbers there are a pretty big order of magnitude in difference. When people vote for somebody, when 20,000 people vote for something, or when 2,500 first place votes come in for a particular candidate, to then say, like, yeah, we know what this candidate thinks, but really we're going to listen to the neighborhood association. That's where it gets problematic. And this is the same problem that you have with public comment. Public comment is, based on studies of public comment, public records requests in Cambridge, is, you know, more white, elderly, homeowner, and wealthy. All four characteristics. They tend to be more of that side of things. And that subcategory of participants also tends to oppose new housing more vigorously. Homeowners are less interested in seeing new housing, not just out of their own financial interest, but they just don't have the same motivation, right? Like, I know I'm probably not going to be able to continue to live in Cambridge in 2 years, and I know that the reason for that is that we have not kept up with demand, and we're not going to keep up with demand, and so I'm going to have to move. I'm going to move somewhere. I don't know where. But in the meantime, I'm going to try and make it better for the person who comes after me. I'm going to try and make it so that the next person who comes in can afford to live in Cambridge. And maybe I won't succeed. Who knows? Maybe we don't get there. Maybe we don't find a way to do affordability. Maybe the problem is just too big for Cambridge to solve all on its own. But we can try. We can do some of the work. And so when I walk into a neighborhood association meeting where we're talking about, like, what would the community want to see, and I understand not wanting offices, not wanting high-end retail, not wanting a mall, not wanting these other things. I understand all those things. What I don't understand is talking to someone who's clearly a young person in a community and a room where there's not a lot of representation of young people and saying, yeah, I don't think that we need to do more for young people. If we have to do that, we'll have to build more schools. And I don't understand why the city continues to legitimize these neighborhood groups where this is the take that they have, where this is the approach that they have, where when I walk in and I've spent 15 minutes there, I walk out pretty much in tears because I'm told, you don't belong here. You're not welcome here. Because I think most of Cambridge people, most of the Cambridge residents that I know, don't feel that way. And the fact that in order to have my voice heard, I might have to walk into a room where someone says, I don't want you here, I don't think you belong here, and try and fight back on that as the first thing that I have to do to say, like, yes, we should have more houses, it's not representative. And it's not the values that Cambridge has. And I think that we should do better. Neighborhood groups are non-representative, and we shouldn't treat them as normative while that remains the case. See you next week.